So in today's Ctrl-Alt-Speech, we're taking a musical vibe and partly in response to the guest host we have today. Prateek, I want you to use Ghana's call to action, Ghana being a kind of Indian music app, to start today's episode for us. Ghana asks users to cue their vibe. And so I want you today to kind of start today's podcast by helping us set the tone for today's recording. What's your vibe?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm actually going to do a little bit of wordplay since we're using an Indian app. So, I think they mean queue in the sense queue your queue playlist. But queue is also the Hindi word for why, right? And if you look around the world right now, it's like, why? What is going on, right? So in many ways, that's currently my vibe.
I love that. It's a kind of running theme of Ctrl-Alt-Speech as well. Why? Well, my vibe today is I'm very much here and ready to listen and learn to you as an expert in the Indian tech policy field. So it's great to have you here. Looking forward to getting into it today.
Thank you for having me.
Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It's April the 10th, 2025, and this week's episode is brought to you with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund. This week, we're talking about not-so-funny deplatforming of comedians in India, moves in the Kenyan courts, and Substack's subtle shift towards standards. Mike is taking a very well-earned break this week, you'll be glad to hear, and I'm very lucky to be joined by Prateek Waghre, a good friend of mine and of the podcast. How are you today, Prateek?
Doing well. Happy to be here.
Very good. Well, Prateek is a fellow at the Tech Policy Press website, which many of you will know. He's a public policy researcher by trade, and he was the former exec director of the Internet Freedom Foundation up until late last year. IFF advocates for digital rights for Indian citizens, and he's got a vast experience of thinking about tech policy and internet regulation. We actually came across each other, Prateek, because of a newsletter you wrote, The Information Ecologist. Yeah. We're internet friends, aren't we? Newsletter friends.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's great to have you on the podcast. We brought Prateek on because last week or a couple of weeks ago, Mike and I were talking about a case that Elon Musk's X was bringing against the Indian government for unlawful content regulation. Some of you will have listened to that episode. And so, Prateek's experience is incredibly valuable now as we delve into some stories that are outside the remit of traditional countries that we talk about on Ctrl-Alt-Speech. So we're talking about India today, we're talking about Kenya, and speech is a global issue, and it's important for us to talk about it in those terms. So Prateek, you kind of wanted to talk a bit about what the context of speech in India is right now, because it's been a fascinating time, very much since the election last year, which we'll get into. Before we jump into the stories, can you give us a sense of what the feeling is towards online speech in the country right now, and some of the kind of key legislations that we should be looking out for and that we'll be talking about today?
Yeah, India is a very, very interesting space. And I think at some point, at different points, both I think Evelyn Douek and Rasmus Nielsen had said that, the battle for freedom of speech in India is probably one of the most important ones on the internet, right? They said this a couple of years ago. I think, the US is potentially a little more interesting at this point. But in that sense, India sort of continued on this trend of what I like to describe as stable dysfunction, right? In the sense that some of the problematic practices continue. A lot of us have gotten used to them, but they continue to escalate. So you're still, of course, extremely worried about them. And we still see, quote unquote, new innovations in terms of the way restrictions in speech are applied, right? And so with that, I think, we'll go a little bit into some of the key legislations that are in place that are used today in this space, right? So I think one, and as you would expect with every country, is you have criminal codes in place which are used to prosecute people very often. In fact, I track the news and you see a couple of cases every day where people are prosecuted for things that they said that could incite enmity between different communities. You, of course, have your standard defamation or defamatory speech kind of things, right? So there are a whole number of provisions that are there in the criminal codes. The interesting side note about the criminal codes is that they were recently overhauled. I think we had 3 sets of criminal laws right from colonial times, but they were recently overhauled in a session of parliament where 150 members of opposition were suspended. So we had a situation where the entire, in a sense that the criminal justice system was overhauled.
Yeah.
but 150 members of parliament from the opposition were not there to debate it. Right now,
Wow.
it's debatable with the way parliament is functioning how much of a difference it would have made. But just the fact that they weren't there is an extremely concerning development, right?
Yeah.
Indian Qanun, a website that tracks Indian legislation, maintains an archive, a library of them. Actually, when these went into effect, said, "Hey, we weren't expecting this to happen."
Wow.
It's just a way in which they were overhauled, right? Almost
Okay.
a shock doctrine sort of being applied. But so on the one hand, you have the criminal codes, then you have the Information Technology Act of 2000, relatively old, I think by internet standards. At the time, was written to govern e-commerce transactions, cybercrime, has certain provisions on just about what type of content you cannot transmit, obscene content, impersonation, cybercrime, and stuff like that, right? So it's a broad, voluminous act, the IT Act, right? Now, under the IT Act, you have various subordinate legislation, and one of them being the infamous IT rules of 2021, right? The information technology rules of 2021.
And it's worth noting this is where I started to become kind of vaguely familiar with the way that India governed its internet space, because this was a big moment, a big update to the IT Act of 2002, right? This is kind of when things all started to kind of shift a little bit.
So you had rules from 2008 that were in place before that to do with intermediaries and their liability. And the backstory also is fascinating because these were notified just after, in early 2021, when there were these farmer protests that were happening in India. And for the context of this conversation, what's relevant is that Twitter at the time, then Twitter, and I still say Twitter invariably, so I'll probably keep doing that. But Twitter at the time pushed back against a number of takedown orders that the government of India had issued. So it initially took action against all of them and then reversed course on what it said were accounts belonging to activists, politicians, journalists, and things like that. So it reversed action, and there was this tussle of sorts going on between the government of India and Twitter, right? And in late February, out of nowhere, you have these IT rules being notified. Now, the last consultation happened in late 2018, right? And the rules that came out were in very, very different form, right? And some of the interesting things that they did with the IT rule was that they split up how it was going to be administered, right? So it had provisions pertaining to the intermediaries. It had provisions pertaining to your streaming platforms. They've, of course, used different terms in the actual legislation, but I'll just use the ones that we use commonly. Right? And then there was one for, and part pertaining to news publishers. And the way this was split up was that the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology would administer the part related to the intermediaries, right, which would cover your social media platforms and your hosting providers and pretty much any service on the internet. And then you had the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which would administer the parts to do with your streaming platforms, so your Netflix, Amazon Prime, various Indian platforms would come under them, and also about digital news publishers, right? And some of the digital news publishers went to court shortly after these rules were notified, and they were able to get some parts of this state, but it effectively, for them, placed a 3-tier mechanism for governance. So you have a self-regulatory body, they have their own set of grievance officers that they do, and then there's a self-regulatory body, and then there's a government body on top of that. Right? And the concern was that if you have a government body on top of that, it has very severe implications for the freedom of press, right? So parts of these certain sections, not in the entirety, but certain sections were withheld or not applied to news publishers, right? The streaming platforms did not push back, at least publicly. So they've sort of been in effect with them since. On the other side, with the intermediaries, you had new provisions being introduced in terms of requirements for in-person or in-country compliance officers and grievance redressal officers, right? And
this is what Mike calls the hostage laws, right? This is one of his famous things,
right? And and I think at the time a number of countries were doing this, and and India also happened to do it around the same time. So and it changes the calculus significantly for companies, right? Who've always traditionally in India complied. There's anyway not been a lot of spirited pushback publicly. Right now, again, I'm not in some of the closed door meetings. I don't know if they push back privately, but at least publicly, with the exception of Twitter a couple of times, most of them haven't really pushed back. But this changes the calculus significantly, right? Because now the risk of non-compliance is employee safety. So it had the hostage taking clause built in. It had traceability requirements, right, which to do with end-to-end encryption, which are also challenged. These were then amended in 2022. Again, there were a couple of amendments, but the one I'll talk about was to do with how they changed obligations for intermediaries, right? Earlier, what used to happen was that intermediaries were obliged to inform their users not to host certain types of content, right? Not to share certain types of content, which could do with
Right.
impersonation, illegal content, obscene content, harmful to children, a number of other conditions. There are about, I think, to date, I think now there are about 10, 11 of them over a period of time. What this amendment did was that it changed the obligation to say you no longer have to just inform them. You have to make reasonable efforts not to cause your users to not host such content, right?
Right.
And that becomes problematic because, again, this is not well defined, and it's been used a couple of times to say, hey, you guys should be taking this down, right? And there wasn't pushback significantly back then. There's just one other important amendment to cover, which is in 2023, you had what we call the fact-checking amendments, right? Where there was an obligation being imposed on intermediaries to take action against content that fact-checking department or a fact-checking unit notified by the government. You have to take action against them if they flag any information about the union government as fake, false, or misleading, right? And this applied in conversations with mainly social media, but the way it was written, it applies to everyone, right? So it would not just be a social media platform. You could go to a hosting provider, you could go to a DNS provider with this and say, hey, you guys, you're obliged to take action against this. This was challenged in court, and as of last year, the Bombay High Court did strike it down as being unconstitutional. Currently, the union government has challenged it, but it hasn't in the Supreme Court, but it hasn't come up since then, right? So that's the IT rules. There are other aspects that play into it in terms of content blocking, and there's some other conversation around broadcasting bill, which we'll probably get into as this conversation goes on. But this is one, the IT rules and the IT Act and the criminal code are one big chunk of what we have in place.
Yeah, really, really helpful, because a lot of listeners will be aware of some of these stories that we talk about each week. And to be honest, I'm talking to you is one of the reasons why I am familiar as I am with the IT rules and what they do. And so I appreciate you kind of breaking out their introduction and those updates in subsequent years. Let's talk a little bit about the political situation in India. There was a big election last year. The ruling BJP party, led by Narendra Modi, failed to form a government in and of itself, but as part of a larger coalition. Can you give us a sense of what the tone is within the political sphere at the moment around online speech and safety? What has changed maybe in the last 12 months or 18 months?
It's been an interesting shift to watch, right? So what happened was that they still formed the government, but as you said, unlike their previous two terms where they commanded a majority by themselves, this time, it was with the help of coalition partners, right? And this at the time came off as a surprise to a lot of people, and I guess if you look back now at a lot of the elections in 2024 where the incumbents did badly, in retrospect, I guess the Bharatiya Janata Party and their supporters may not be that unhappy, right? In the sense that it was still able to come back into power, right? Now, in the previous term, there was conversation around Digital India Bill, right? Which was in many ways mirrored the Online Safety Act, right? But minus a lot of the articulation that went along with the Online Safety Act, right?
Right.
That conversation does seem to have slowed down a little. It slowed down in the build up to the election, then it's not really come back in a major way. A couple of other things that were on the anvil in the last term were around competition regulation and things like that. Some of that also now seems to have slowed down. There's been some reportage in press last week about how the sources in the government say that they're going easy on some of this stuff for now, right? But what has come into conversation is things like the broadcasting bill, which is essentially about bringing all forms of, so you're talking about your satellite broadcasting, right, and internet broadcasting and things like that, right, under one regulation, right? Today, some of these are under the cable television news regulation and things like that. So you're trying to bring that and the internet all into under one regulation.
So maybe that's a good place to kind of lead us into our first story, because I think we'll talk about the broadcasting bill. It's a very interesting piece of legislation that you and I talked about before we started. I mean, this first story that you've brought to Ctrl-Alt-Speech this week, Prateek, is one that illustrates some of the challenges that we're seeing in India and actually elsewhere in the world as well. It's kind of a story that ends up with a kind of deplatforming, you could say, of a user, although the conditions of that are a bit mysterious, so we'll talk about those. But just generally shows the kind of highly politicized nature in which political opponents are operating online in India. Give us an overview of the chronology of this story, because it starts way back in February with a kind of a comedian getting up on stage and delivering some gags, right?
Yeah. So this this is to do with Kunal Kamra, who incidentally was one of the first petitioners against the fact-checking amendment of the IT rules, and then subsequently joined by the Editors Guild of India, Association of Indian Magazines, some others as well, right? So he's been continuously outspoken in some ways, right? And there's a joke by another comedian, which I was mentioning to you earlier, right? Varun Grover, who basically said that, look, there's an order to these things, right? We write up a comedy show, we tour with it, at the end of it we put it on YouTube, and then we go to jail, right? Fortunately, in this case, it's not, no one has gone to prison just yet, right? But that's, in a way what happened, right? He was
right.
In early February, I think it's sometime in early February in Mumbai, he recorded this comedy special, which is called Naya India, right? Translates to New India, right? It's essentially, again, political overtones in that naming, where he essentially, so Mumbai is in the state of Maharashtra, right? Which has a coalition government with the Bharatiya Janata Party and a couple of other parties, including one faction of the Shiv Sena and another faction of the Nationalist Congress Party, right? Or the NCP. Now, he essentially made a comment about the leader of the Shiv Sena, of the faction of the Shiv Sena, Eknath Shinde, essentially alluding to the fact that he switched loyalties and calling him in Hindi a Gaddar, which translates to traitor or being unfaithful.
Right.
And again, it was just one joke with political over,
right. But nothing that most comedians don't do in a regular show, right? It's kind of pretty common.
Well, in India nowadays, not so much, right?
For reasons we'll go into.
Yeah, right. But like you said, it should be something that's very normal, right? That you say something funny about a politician because they've done something funny, or they've done something we find funny, or we're just critiquing them, right? It shouldn't be an act of bravery, right? To critique a politician, but that's sort of where we are. Now, what happened with that was, so in late March, this video was actually uploaded onto YouTube somewhere around 22nd, 23rd March, right? And I think, it got traction over the weekend. And I think between Sunday and Monday, you actually had people, supporters of the party, go in and vandalize the studio, right? Or the location where
it was hosted.
Where it was hosted. Right? And there was actually another show going on at the time, and they cleared it out. And then they proceeded to vandalize, vandalize the space. And I was joking about this, that, we're graduating from content takedown, because they've not actually taken down the video in this case. We're sort of shifting from content takedowns to venue takedowns, right? We're just going the place, the special was recorded, right? And you, of course, then had other elements that we've now seen, unfortunately, all too often, is that you had the police coming in, filing an FIR against Kunal Kamra, who's subsequently gone. So he's not in the state of Maharashtra. He's in another state in the southern part of the country called Tamil Nadu.
Just remind listeners what an FIR is, Prateek.
Yeah, so an FIR is the first information report, right, which you basically procedurally file as a complaint comes in. Now, again, in reality, that doesn't always happen. There's a lot of discretion that the police officers show, but it's essentially the first step in the investigation. And then they asked him to come to Maharashtra and be part of the investigation, right? Now, again, that's the way of saying it. There is potentially a larger risk there, right? So he's gone to court in another state, to the Madras High Court, and essentially asked for protection from arrest. And for now, he's been given interim protection in that sense. And I think that will continue until another hearing takes place, right? But so you have this scenario where you've cracked a joke, the place where you recorded it has been vandalized, and the police is coming after you. While there has also, and I should state this in fairness, that there has also been investigations against some of the people who were part of the mob that vandalized it. Some of them got arrested. But there's also some curious reporting coming out of that, based on analyzing the CCTV footage, was that police personnel seem to have been present around the time the vandalism was taking place, but did not intervene, right? So again, that's quite concerning, because again, you've taken into account that it's the same party that's in government in that state, right? And law enforcement is answerable to them. So so they didn't really intervene in that sense. The other side of it was that over last weekend, around Saturday, around 4th April, I think, if I'm getting my dates right, the India Today reported that Kunal Kamra's profile on Book My Show had got delisted. Now, Book My Show, essentially a ticketing platform, and the largest one in India with a significant market share. And they seem to have removed his profile, or his profile could no longer be found, right? And they showed screenshots in there It basically showing when you search for his name, nothing turned up. Now it's unclear. I think from Sunday onward, I could see it, and again there was reporting on back from Monday that it seemed to have been back online. And Book My Show themselves have issued a statement which is not very easy to understand. There's about 150 words in there which don't say much, but seem to imply that they did not deactivate the profile and spoke about how different partners have control over things like that. So it's not really clear at this point. Two things aren't clear, right? One is who actually delisted the profile, whether it was Book My Show or someone else, and whether any shows were actually delisted, because I don't actually know at this stage whether he had shows listed beyond those dates. I think the other bit that's relevant to mention here is that the party, that the Shiv Sena and members of the party actually wrote to Book My Show before the profile went down. They actually wrote to Book My Show essentially asking for some form of action to be taken. And it was after that the account profile seemed to have been missing, right? So it's still a little fuzzy in terms of what really happened there.
Yeah, and I just want to read a little bit out from that letter because I have it in front of me. It's from, I think, the General Secretary of the Shiv Sena party. And it's a really interesting letter that he says is in his individual capacity as a concerned citizen. So first of all, he is part of the ruling political party in the region, but he's also talking as a kind of individual citizen, which I think is always an interesting thing to mention in your first paragraph of the letter. But then he says, the actions of the comedian appear to be part of a broader criminal conspiracy driven by ulterior motives that extend far beyond the realm of humor and satire. Mr. Camera's premeditated, scripted, provocative, and malicious statements have consistently crossed ethical and legal boundaries. So it's a very kind of like hard-hitting letter that's been sent to this ticketing platform.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, has led to the profile of the comedian go down or kind of go missing for, we think, kind of maybe a day or two. Yeah. Really interesting story, Prateek. Like, to what extent does this kind of, I guess, like, is this a symptom of the way that politics and online speech are intertwined in the country? And like, how often does this come to a head, would you say? Like, is this relatively common?
Yeah, there's an interesting thing here, right? In the sense that if you look at the way they've gone about and done it, right? They've not really followed any norm in the sense, right? They've gone and vandalized the place. It's not like, look, you have a problem with your video, you either complain and look, there are technically under the IT rules, there are provisions where you can file a grievance and stuff like that, right? They've not bothered with any of that, right? They've gone and vandalized it. So it's almost norm entrepreneurship, right? You can call it in a sense, right? And that is, unfortunately, I would say, happens reasonably frequently. Another case, which is again happening right now or in some form, is to do, and this is not a political actor and an individual, this is the government itself, which blocked the website of a very old magazine in Tamil Nadu called Vikatan, right? And what the magazine had done was that, so around the time President Donald Trump met Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the US, they published a caricature or a comic which showed them, meeting each other with Prime Minister Modi in chains and Donald Trump looking happy, right? And it was meant to be a comment on how the Indian government has not pushed back strongly and things like that. And what happened was that their entire website was blocked, right? Without any notice being given to them.
Wow.
So around the 15th of February, their website just suddenly became inaccessible from most parts of the country, or all parts of the country. A day later, they got a notice from the Ministry of Information Broadcasting, because like I said, IT rules, now this stuff goes under Ministry of Information Broadcasting. They got a notice from them. But this notice seemed to be specifically about that comic strip, right? Not about the entire website being blocked. And they were called to participate in an interdepartmental committee hearing, right?
Right.
Which tend to be confidential. You don't really know what happened in there. You're not supposed to say what the proceedings were. But that committee essentially ruled that it would continue to stay down. Again, still fuzzy on what happened to the website. But so they went to court, to Madras High Court with this. And what the court has said, it did give them interim relief. I think there's a caveat here in the way it happened, because they asked for the website to be unblocked, but they said that you need to take down the comic strip before the website gets activated, right? And now what the court has said is that we'll decide the question of whether that particular comic strip violated the blocking rule, violated the law or not, is secondary, and that needs to be decided. But for now, keep it down, right? But what's happened is that it's effectively a takedown order, right? Because you've gone and taken down the whole website first, right? As opposed to asking them to come for the hearing without actually taking any action and then ruling on it. Because like I said, you're being an entrepreneur with norms. you've first gone 100 feet forward and then you step back 5 feet in a sense, or maybe 10 feet, right? However you want to quantify that. But in a sense, that comic strip today remains blocked, right? There's, of course, in both these, there's a Streisand effect element here, right? I think
Mike will be delighted to hear the Streisand effect.
Mike will be happy, right? That we sort of spoken about the Streisand effect. I think the caveat that I'll add, and we were discussing this earlier, is that there's an addendum, I guess, to the Streisand effect, right? In low rule of law jurisdictions that one can think of, is that once Streisand is bad, is counterproductive or bad PR, multiple Streisands are a demonstration of capability, right? Because now, if you imagine this happening repeatedly, and again, it's happened multiple times in the past, you're essentially then creating a chilling effect, right? Now, for example, what happened with Wickerton happened with another magazine a couple of years earlier with The Caravan, right? And again, it's common for comics to be targeted, for stand-up comics in India to be targeted. And as a result, what's happened is very few of them actually do political comedy anymore, right? To the extent that the ones who do it, we call them brave, right? And not to take nothing away from them, they are brave, but we shouldn't have to be in an environment where, like I said, just critiquing the government is considered bravery, right? So we have an addendum to the Streisand effect, right? A Streisandum, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, interesting. And then so these two examples, and I guess the updates to the IT rules that you mentioned at the top of today's episode, which put more emphasis on platforms preventing users from uploading speech that is likely to kind of contravene the IT rules, again, gives this sense to me, at least from as an outsider, that there's a kind of concerted effort to push back against users' rights in terms of what they can say online. To what extent are you concerned, and like, are other people concerned in the country about the direction of travel? You know, you worked for the IFF, you were dealing with this day in, day out. Listeners might be kind of quite shocked to hear that this happens in India. Like, what is the perception amongst like the general public, people like yourself who are clued into these issues?
Yeah, so this is where the term stable dysfunction comes back, right? In the sense that, as you said, the direction is concerning, but we're sort of seeing the same the same things happen again and again, and it's not just at the level of content removal, right? And I think there's a number of formal, informal mechanisms that are used to pressurize people. For example, if you go and vandalize a space, or venues are no longer are going to think twice about whom they host, right? Similarly, if you send income tax notices to various organizations, right, or you go after their ability to receive foreign funding under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act or the FCRA, you're sort of tightening the ability for them, or you're shrinking the space for them to really say things, right? Every organization individuals are going to think twice before speaking out. And it also happens, and it's not just the union government that does it, right? This is unfortunately almost a feature of the Indian politician, right? In terms of wanting to control speech in some shape or form. So even when you have different parties in government at the state level, you find that they do things like go after journalists or go after local opposition leaders and things like that, right? So there is some of them are coming up with their own fact-checking units and social media surveillance mechanisms where they want to be able to, quote unquote, monitor the conversation on social media, right? And all of this often with law enforcement involved. So then it's going to have a coercive element to it as well, right? Now, it's, I guess, trying very hard to look at silver lining. It's not as efficient today. So there are still some spaces. There are, of course, folks who continue to speak out and who are able to speak out. But the trends have been concerning for a while, right? And I think that's the challenge.
Yeah. And you were mentioning before we started recording about how there's been this surge of people using the internet in India. It kind of happened in the 2015, 2016. And since then, the country's been ruled by the BJP. So a lot of the kind of internet regulatory regime in India has been kind of decided and defined by one party. Obviously, since election last year, that's shifted a little bit. And you've seen a little bit of a shift in the approach as a result of this coalition. Talk a little bit about that and maybe what you see the future looking like.
Yeah, so I think that there's, like I said, there's unfortunately this thread that runs through, right? In the sense that some of the problematic regulation that the Bharatiya Party is using today or the BJP is using today, not necessarily all, in the online speech domain, but in other cases as well, have been initially or initiated by previous government, right? Or the UPA government, which had the Congress party at its center. But there's been a difference or certainly an escalation in the way they've been utilized and the extent to which they've been utilized. And as I was talking about the informal mechanisms being used as well, right? So it's not just taking down the speech, it's also creating enough disincentives for people to speak out in the first place, right? And that, like I said, unfortunately, a lot of parties do it, but it's, again, there's been an escalation on that front.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, that's a really, really helpful overview. I mean, I feel like I've learned more in the last 30 minutes about the Indian kind of regulatory regime and online speech in the country than I have for a long time. So thank you for sharing some of that.
Back on the broadcasting bill. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Provisions.
We'll come back to that before we wrap up, if nothing else, and do a bit of a look forward. Talking of kind of disincentives for speech, I mean, kind of brings us neatly onto our next story, which is from Kenya. This is a story that actually broke just after we recorded last week, but is important enough, I think, for us to go a bit deeper on it today. There are 3 big cases happening in Kenya, as many of our listeners will know. And this latest development is related to one of them. So I was going to kind of just unpack a little bit about what those cases are again for people. So there are 3 cases, one with a guy called Daniel Moteng, who is a moderator for a company called Sama, who is taking Meta to court for mental health challenges as a result of the work he did and also union busting. He went on to become kind of, I think he was on the front cover of Time. He's been a Mozilla Person of the Year, I think. So his courage to speak out is something that many people have recognized, and that case is still ongoing. He is also part of a larger group of moderators, 185, who are taking Meta to court for the kind of allegedly illegal mass firings that they all suffered as a result of that case. So 185 of them lost their jobs at very short notice as Meta moved away from one BPO, one outsourcing company, and moved to another. That was given the go-ahead to be heard in Kenya last September. And the third case is with 2 men, the son of a man who was killed during the Ethiopian civil uprisings a couple of years ago in 2022, and an Amnesty International researcher. They are arguing, and this is where this week's developments have taken place, they are arguing that Meta's algorithmic amplification of posts on the platform led to the professor's death and led to the hate speech that the researcher faced. And this is a case that's been put off several times and was postponed in January. This week, it was given the approval by the Kenyan High Court to go ahead in Nairobi. Now, that's a significant development for a number of reasons. It means that Meta can be sued now for the alleged violence related to these cases in Ethiopia. And that's kind of obviously significant for the 2 plaintiffs and for the issues around the kind of Ethiopian civil war, which I've covered in Everything in Moderation at the time. But it also might open the gates for similar suits in other countries, which I think is also really significant. And, Prateek, you've seen some of these cases of Meta products leading to violence in India yourself over the past few years, which we can talk about. But, previously Meta has faced court cases mainly in the US and mainly in Ireland, where it's got kind of 2 major hubs. But if this case obviously goes to court now and is ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, then it might lead to others who want to bring Meta to court in countries like Nigeria or South Africa or Brazil, where we know there are kind of ongoing issues. That could open the door to many more cases. And that's really interesting. I think, this is a relatively small country, Kenya, challenging Meta's significant dominance and obviously the bringing a platform to kind of heal for some of the challenges and the harms that it's allegedly created. What did you think about this story, Prateek? And you talked a bit about the farmer riots in India, and some of that was WhatsApp driven. How do you feel about how Meta and it's being challenged in Kenya?
No, so just to clarify, the farmer protests didn't have a WhatsApp connection.
Oh, okay, sorry.
But there have been over the years multiple cases of lynchings where rumors have spread on WhatsApp, right? I think that's a little, I'm not extremely familiar with the Kenyan context, but I think if I just draw on my lens from the Indian experience, I'm honestly a little torn about it, right? Because on the one hand, yes, we do want ways to hold platforms accountable. The question that always, when I've looked at these debates in India is that you tend to then put too much of the emphasis on the platform and their actions at some time. And often to ignoring the existing social problems in society, right? Again, like I said, I'm not commenting directly on the Kenyan case because I'm not as familiar with the specifics, right? In terms of, what evidence there is that Meta was actually negligent and things like that. And, and if there is evidence to that point, then yes, there's potentially some merit there. But just on the broader question, how do we, where do we index between looking at social problem or putting the emphasis on platform and platform action while potentially ignoring the social problem, right? And that's where, honestly, I'm a little torn, right?
Yeah. And I think that's fair. I mean, the interesting part about Kenya is that Kenya has a large unemployment issue, particularly among, the youth population there. And content moderation, data labeling, these kinds of jobs and the BPOs and the outsourcing companies that provide those jobs are a massive focus for the Kenyan government. And last year, as this case was kind of rumbling on in the background, actually President Ruto met a contingent from Meta, including Nick Clegg, or Sir Nick Clegg, I think I should call him. And there was a conversation about investment in the kind of tech and AI space in Kenya, because Kenya obviously sees it as a way of addressing the unemployment challenge. So yes, you're right. There's always a kind of existing social issue that maybe the tech companies are trying to address and that politicians are trying to address as well, which maybe is a broader point. But I think this is potentially very, very important. And this case has been running for more than 2 years now. And the appeals and the kind of ongoing issue is something we've talked a bit about on Ctrl-Alt-Speech a lot. And so I guess it's interesting to see the perseverance needed to bring a case like this to court. And it's likely that Meta will appeal. We don't know when the case will go ahead and if that appeal will come. But nonetheless, this is Kenyan's kind of highest court saying that this case can go ahead in the country. The specific point that I will mention is that Meta had pushed back and said, Kenya doesn't have a jurisdiction here. We don't have a kind of setup here. We don't have operations here. But the point that the High Court has made is that Nairobi was the place where the content was moderated in relation to the Ethiopian users. So a lot of the base was in Nairobi, and therefore it does have a jurisdiction to take this case. So again, I think it puts a pressure on the outsourced nature of content moderation for large platforms, because it's a risk really for platforms to have these outsourced companies that are applying policies that have been set up, but the companies will say that there are strict provisions in place and strict standards in place, but actually it's very hard to control the number of moderators that the outsourced companies employ. And so I can foresee in time actually this accelerating the move to a more automated moderation, a move away from BPOs, and potentially with the issues that come with those shifts, away from a human-led moderation to a more automated, kind of almost invisible moderation. So yeah, big update in terms of those stories, and we'll kind of
just to add to your last point. I think the automated moderation, and in a sense, isn't that what, at least in the US context, Mark Zuckerberg announced earlier in the year, that they do want to shift to automated action combined with user flagging?
Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly the case, and focusing more on illegal harms, leaving users to do the rest, and having kind of automated tooling and technology route some of those reports in a way that's efficient for the company, in a way that outsourcing companies aren't right now and are quite expensive. So yeah, interesting to see that issue come to the fore again this week. Prateek, let's go to a couple of other smaller stories that we've flagged this week. I have got one that I wanted to talk through, but you pulled out a really interesting Reuters story that came out yesterday about how social media is going to become one of the ways that the US administration screen immigrants. This feels like a kind of maybe an episode from the upcoming series of Black Mirror. This is frightening stuff.
Yeah, no, extremely dystopian, and that's precisely what got my attention as well, right? Because again, sitting here, we're hearing about people from India either self-deporting or being asked to self-deport and things like that, right? And so some of them just waking up suddenly getting an email saying that your status is no longer valid and you need to move back, right? So you're putting that on steroids, especially in a speech context, right? Where you're essentially saying that if you have said, and it seems like if you've taken any stance that's in support of the Palestinian people, that's being considered anti-Semitic, right?
Yeah.
At least the way the report has been worded. And now for that to have implications for people's visa status, including I think those present in the country.
Yeah.
I think that just sounds severely dystopian and very worrying, right? And I think from a global perspective, it's also more concerning because on the one hand, you're used to America being this champion of free speech
Yeah.
in a sense, right? And yes, the First Amendment is, not an expert on it, but it held up as this exceptional thing. And you're now then seeing that if America is going to act this way, how are the other more authoritarian leaning governments or outright authoritarian governments going to react or going to respond or going to continue to use it as justification for doing what they want to?
Yeah. It goes back to that thing that Mike and I talked about free speech being selectively applied in the US at the moment, isn't it? And yeah, this is frightening. An actual government organization, an agency of the Homeland Security Department, basically reviewing somebody's social media posts and deciding on the basis of that and their support for the Palestinian state that means that they are anti-Semitic, which we know is those two things are not necessarily the same thing, and potentially kind of deporting them or rejecting visa applications on the basis of that. I mean, this, it could potentially affect tourists as well. People coming into the country, again, from the information we have from the Reuters report, if you are wanting to spend any time in the US but have previously indicated support for Palestinians, then there's a sense that you may be rejected. And again, this has been widely criticized by groups of all kinds, which I think is really heartening. It's the fact that free speech groups and also groups that are fighting anti-Semitism have both turned around and said this isn't right, which is pleasing, but may not stop this going into effect. But yeah, what else is kind of on your plate, Prateek? I mean, any other stories that you want to talk through? I mean, should we talk a bit about the kind of Karnataka X update? Mike and I talked a bit about this on the podcast a few weeks ago. Helpfully, there's been a bit of an update this week that you can speak to.
Yeah. And maybe it'll help if I just talk through how blocking provisions work in India.
Yeah, there are two approaches.
There are two ways that this happens. So there's what we call approach one, right, which specifically uses certain, basically Section 69A of the IT Act. And what that implies is that there are certain conditions about, to do with security of the state, friendly relations with foreign countries, public order, a couple of conditions under which an order can be issued, right? And in this case, these are meant to be written orders. They're meant to be reasoned. Now that does not always happen, right? And they work alongside what's called the 2009 blocking rule, which specifies the procedure and also has the ability to issue these orders in a confidential way or confidentially, which means that, as an example, if the government of India was to send Twitter a takedown order related to something I have said, Twitter cannot show the order to me. And they cannot tell me which of these 4 or 5 conditions or which of these conditions the government believes I violated, which then means it's hard for me to actually challenge it and say, this was the problem, right? And this is the one that was used in the Bikaton case, right? It was they were issued under this mechanism, Section 69A.
And also, did Twitter use this previously before Elon Musk took over the company?
Yes. So this approach one is what Twitter had challenged previously,
right,
a couple of years ago, back in I think mid 2022, where they argued back then that the government really wasn't following the laid down procedure, it wasn't reasoning the orders particularly well, and it was also using it to block accounts, right? So you're supposed to give URLs. And instead of giving specific posts, they would give a user's account, right? Which is,
right,
Twitter argued, is also a restriction of future speech, right? So you're not just taking down something they said in the past, you're restricting the ability to speak in the future, right? In that case, the Karnataka High Court actually ruled against Twitter at the time and even imposed costs on them. And by the time this happened, the Twitter acquisition completed, Elon Musk was in charge, right?
He was carrying his sink into the office at that point, probably. That was his famous... He had more things on his mind.
Yeah. So I wasn't sure if an adversarial ruling came out, would Twitter actually challenge it, but they did. They did challenge it. Now that challenge is still going on. That's not the one that that's recent, but that's still going on in parallel. The recent challenge is to do with what is approach 2, right? And this refers to a specific section in the IT Act, Section 79(3)(b, which essentially talks about the platform having to respond once it has actual knowledge, right? And there's context to what actual knowledge means, but when it has actual knowledge for unlawful content, it needs to act. Otherwise, there is a risk to its safe harbor status. Now, actual knowledge in a previous court case, 2015 share single judgment, was basically specified as it should be either a notice from an authorized government agency or a court order, right? So it can't be me complaining to Twitter saying, "Hey, take this down," right? So so there was a specific definition for what actual knowledge meant. But the way this is being used more recently is that now it says it says authorized government agency, but what's happening is that the number of agencies that are being authorized to do this is increasing. And a recent example is just that the Department of Railways was given this ability to do this in December last year, and since then they've used it about 7 times, right? As per a report in the Hindustan Times, including, and this is relevant, when there were reports of a stampede in New Delhi railway station, right? And Twitter was issued a notice to take down media related to the stampede, right? So Twitter is arguing that now this method doesn't have any of the checks and balances that approach one has, right? Which, as it is, civil society feels aren't adequate, but okay, at least in theory there's something. This doesn't even have that, right?
Right.
And so this is what Twitter has challenged, basically saying that, look, you've now created an alternate mechanism where you're not following whatever procedures you're supposed to follow under approach one, and essentially leading to that, right? And there was another part which they challenged specifically around the use of a portal, the Sahyog portal, where number of government agencies and intermediaries would communicate about takedown orders, right? And I think they basically asked not to be forced to participate in that portal because they felt it enabled it, it sort of furthered this regime, right? So that was what Twitter argued. Now, what the government has defended its use in an affidavit that it filed, essentially saying, and they used this term, which I thought was quite interesting. They said these two approaches operate in mutually exclusive claims, right? Which is interesting phrasing, but essentially saying that one constitute orders. So approach one constitutes orders, written orders, and they're supposed to be, and it comes with penal provision if you don't comply. The other approach is notices, right? And that's the term that they've used, and it just has implications for safe harbor. So that's how the government is defending it. But the existence of this approach is something that again, civil society has been concerned about for a while for precisely this reason, and more so because now you're seeing, for example, the Delhi police can issue orders this way, right? And this is not just union government agencies, state government agencies, like I said, Delhi police and things like that, right? So you're giving more government agencies the ability to issue takedown orders, what are essentially takedown orders. You can call them a notice, right? But with the implication that your safe harbor status is at risk, right? It's a technicality, right? No platform is actually going to risk that, right?
Yeah.
It's essentially a takedown order minus whatever limited safeguards, approach one has, right? So I fully expect a lot of good departments to be very trigger happy with this.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting context because this is obviously what makes the pushback from Twitter X so interesting. It seems like there's a justifiable case there, and we'll continue to kind of track this one. And we're probably at the point where we'll wrap up today, Prateek. But the context you've given us is so valuable in terms of understanding the nature of online speech in the country. And I just want to thank you for making the time today to share your knowledge. We haven't even probably scratched the surface of some of the other legislation we could have gone into, but just want to thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll have you back on Ctrl-Alt-Speech soon.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here again.
Brilliant. And for listeners who are tuning in today, we're back next week, Mike and I together. If you liked today's episode and enjoy the podcast on a regular basis, don't forget to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Really helps us be discovered. And don't forget to leave us a literary themed review in whatever platform you use. Looking forward to speaking to you. See you soon. Take care. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's CTRL-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.